Chapter 23, Legal Implications in the Nursing Practice. Constitutional law is derived from federal and state constitutions. Statutory law comes from statutes passed by the United States Congress and state legislatures. These laws can either be civil or criminal. Criminal laws actually protect the society and provide punishment for crimes which are defined by local, state, or federal jurisdiction. Civil laws, these protect the rights of individuals and provide for fair and equitable treatment when civil wrongs or violations occur. The Nurse Practice Acts are civil state laws that define nursing and the standards a nurse must meet within the state's boundaries. Administrative law or regulatory law more clearly defines expectations related to civil and criminal laws. Common law originates from decisions that were made without law. Case law describes decisions made in legal cases that were resolved within the court system. The scope of nursing practice defines nursing and reflects the values of the nursing profession. Standards of nursing care actually reflect the knowledge and skill ordinarily possessed and used by prudent nurses. Nursing is defined, and the responsibilities and expectations of a nurse are clearly explained. Nursing practice, the scope of our practice, defines the scope, the function, and the role of the nurse within the practice and guide a nurse's practice. Sometimes when they are used in legal actions, sometimes when they're used, a legal action may be taken against a nurse. The standard of proof is typically what a reasonably prudent nurse would do under similar circumstances in a geographic area where the alleged breach or negligence occurred. Malpractice is a result of nursing care falling below a standard of care. This case study is of a potential malpractice incident. So once you read through this slide, stop and think a minute, what would be the next step for the nurses that are involved? So the nurse called Lynette's healthcare provider but could not make contact. As we're going throughout this case study, try to identify responsibilities of the nurse that's involved and think about what should be done during this situation. A new Patient's Bill of Rights that was created by the Affordable Health Care Act prohibits patients from being denied health care coverage due to prior existing conditions. It limits the amount of removes limits on the amount of care for those conditions and or an accidental mistake in paperwork when a patient got sick. The Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act prohibits the transfer of patients from private to public hospitals without appropriate screening and stabilization. This is intended to prevent what is known in medicine as patient dumping. HIPAA established a patient's right to consent to the use and disclosure of their protected health information, to inspect and copy their medical record, and to amend a mistake or an incomplete information. It as well limits who can access the patient record. It establishes the basis for the privacy and confidentiality concerns and viewed as two basic rights within the United States healthcare system. Privacy is the right of patients to keep personal information from being disclosed. Confidentiality protects private patient information once it is disclosed in healthcare institutions and settings. The High-Tech Act, this is where nurses must ensure that patients' personal health information is not inadvertently used or shared on social media, and that protected data are not disclosed other than what is permitted by the patients. The ADA prohibits discrimination and ensures equal opportunities for people with disabilities in employment, state and local government services, public accommodations, commercial facilities, and transportations. The MHPAEA requires health insurance companies to provide coverage for mental health and substance use disorder treatment, just like they do for medical coverage. The PSDA requires healthcare institutions to provide written information to patients that's concerning their rights to make decisions about their own care, including the right to refuse treatment and to formulate an advance directive. A patient's record must indicate whether a patient has signed an advanced care directive and include a copy of the directive if it is available. The UAGA provides the foundation for the National Organ Donation System. Patient autonomy, individual autonomy, and public trust remain the ethical principles on which organ donation occurs. An individual who is at least 18 years of age may make an organ donation. OBRA altered the way in which healthcare is provided to older adults. It focused on patients' rights, quality of life, quality of care, and the physical environments in which patients lived. This act addressed the use of both physical and chemical restraints. The legal definition of a restraint is any manual method, physical or mechanical device, or material or equipment that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a patient to move freely with a chemical strain, including the use of medication to alter the behavior of the patient. Each state law directs how healthcare will be delivered and regulates as well as license healthcare agencies and their professionals that provide care to citizens. Nurse practice acts are state laws intended to protect citizens, make nurses accountable, and ensure that care is consistent with best practice within the scope and standards of nursing. The creation of State Board of Nursing, sometimes called the Nursing Commission, is part of a State Nurse Practice Act. States use the NCLEX for nursing examinations. Legally, a license to practice nursing is considered a privilege and not a right. Licensure permits people to offer special skills to the public, and it also provides legal guidelines for protection of the public. Professional licensure defense is expensive when nurses do not have insurance that covers the cost of keeping their license to practice nursing. On an average, $12,000 or more is required to respond to a complaint and effectively defend a claim. Nurses often believe that either their personal or their employer's malpractice insurance will include the cost of defending and retaining their nursing license. In most cases, this is false. Professional license defense insurance is a contract between the nurse and the insurance company. Healthcare acts within each state describe and define the minimum standards of care that will be provided within their area. These acts and the regulations that are associated with them are interrelated with other laws that govern the nursing practice. Patient's signed consent form is necessary for any admission to a healthcare agency, an invasive procedure such as an intravenous central line, surgery, and other treatment programs such as chemo, as well as participation in research studies. Informed consent is a patient's agreement to have a medical procedure after receiving full disclosure of the risks, benefits, the alternatives, and the consequences related to refusal. Good Samaritan laws encourage healthcare professionals to assist in times of emergency. These laws limit liability and offer legal immunity if a nurse helps at the scene of an accident. If the patient subsequently develops any complications due to the nurse's action, the nurse will be immune from liability if the nurse acted without gross negligence. Public health laws affect individuals, populations, and communities. They can either be federal or state statutes that are intended to improve the health of individuals. State legislatures enact statutes under healthcare codes which describe the requirements for reporting communicable disease, school immunizations, and other conditions that are intended to promote health and reduce health risks in communities. There are two standards for the determination of death. The cardiopulmonary standard requires irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions. The whole brain standard requires irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain that includes the brainstem. A nurse is caring for a patient who states, "I just want to die." For the nurse to comply with this request, the nurse should discuss what? The answer is D. Advance directives are written documents that outlay the patient's wishes should they become incapacitated. Torts are civil wrongful acts or omissions made against a person or property. They can be classified as intentional, quasi-intentional, or unintentional. Intentional torts are deliberate acts against a person or their property that may result in both civil and criminal actions. Assault is an intentional threat toward another person that places that person in reasonable fear of harmful, imminent, or any type of unwelcomed contact. Battery is any intentional offensive touching without consent or lawful justification. The contact can be harmful to the patient and cause an injury, or it can just be offensive to the patient's personal dignity. Quasi-intentional torts are acts in which a person may not intend to cause harm to another, but does. The person invades another's privacy or in some way defames their character. Quasi-intentional torts are alleged when a person should have known that harm to another person could occur. Defamation of character is the publication of false statements that result in damage to a person's reputation. Slander occurs when one speaks falsely about another. Libel is the written defamation of character. Unintentional torts happen when a person is harmed and the person inflicting the harm should have known that his or her actions were less than acceptable scope and standard of practice. Negligence is conduct that falls below the generally accepted standard of care of a reasonably prudent nurse. Malpractice is actually a type of negligence. A person being held liable for malpractice must be a professional. Certain criteria are necessary to establish nursing malpractice. Number 1, the nurse owed a duty to the patient. Number 2, the nurse did not carry out or breached the duty. Number 3, the patient was injured due to the breach in duty. And number 4, damages or remedies are allowed under state law to make the person whole in the eyes of the court. Roe v. Wade, the United States Supreme Court ruled that there is a fundamental right to privacy, which includes a woman's decision to terminate a pregnancy. The court ruled that during the first trimester, a woman could end her pregnancy without state regulation because the risk of natural mortality from abortion is less than that with normal childbirth. In 1994, the Oregon Death with Dignity Act was the first statute that legislatively defined death with dignity, sometimes also known as physician-assisted suicide. The statute stated that a competent individual with a terminal disease could make an oral and written request for medication to end their life in a humane and dignified manner. A terminal disease is defined as an incurable and irreversible disease that has been medically confirmed and will, within reasonable medical judgment, produce death within 6 months. Nursing students are liable if their actions exceed their scope of practice and cause harm to patients. Regardless of intent, students are expected to know what they can and cannot do when providing care to patients. Adequate staffing is required to ensure patient safety and satisfaction with care. For nursing assignments, nurses are sometimes required to work on a unit where they do not typically care for patients. In this practice, often called floating, nurses will temporarily work in another area because there's not enough nurses to care for the number of patients and the acuity of the patient's needs on the unit at that time. If as a nurse you are asked to float, you should inform the supervisor if you do not have the required education or experience to care for the patients assigned to you. Patient abandonment occurs when a nurse refuses to provide care for a patient after having established a nurse-patient relationship. Before having established a nurse-patient relationship, the nurse may refuse an assignment when, number 1, the nurse lacks the knowledge or the skill to provide competent care. Number 2, care exceeds the Nurse Practice Act is expected. Number 3, the health of the nurse or the nurse's unborn child is directly threatened by the type of assignment. Number 4, orientation to the unit has not been completed and safety is at risk. Number 5, the nurse clearly states and documents a conscientious objection on the basis of morals, ethical, or religious grounds. Or number 6, the nurse's clinical judgment is impaired as a result of fatigue, resulting in a safety risk for the patients. Nursing delegation is defined in the Nurse Practice Act. Regulations will vary from state to state. Nurse delegation means that a nurse educates, observes, and verifies that a non-nurse can do a specific task that is usually completed by a nurse. The nurse always retains responsibility to supervise care received by the patient and is to periodically reassess whether the nurse delegation continues to be appropriate. Risk management and performance improvement. These are both designed to determine if the care provided to patients can be increased and be any more safe than it currently is. Each of these is a committee or an individual that keeps statistical information to determine whether or not patients are provided with safe care and there is minimal risk. Sometimes nurses can be called in trial as a defense witness because we will testify as a nurse expert about standards of care. We want to determine that there's no conflict of interest before we accept the case. Nurses can give depositions related to some act that happened with patient care, and their expertise is based on their opinion or on the standards of practice. So when you read this study, answer this question in your mind. Is Lynette capable of providing consent for the procedure? What is the standard of care that is due to Lynette? A student nurse employed as a nursing assistant may perform care The answer is C. Student nurses should not perform a task that is not within their job description of the facility where they work. When reading this, answer what are the liability issues that exist with this case study. You are about to administer an oral medication and you question the dosage. You should do what? The answer is B. If you find one to be erroneous or harmful, further clarification from the healthcare provider is needed. If the provider confirms the order and you still believe that it is inappropriate, use the agency chain of command and inform your direct supervisor. As nurses, it is vital that we maintain our current knowledge of the standards of care as well as our nursing practice. This is why many nurses will become involved in one type of professional organization. So that way it helps us maintain our current knowledge and understanding of the laws as well as our standards that we must uphold.